members of the Ohio State Beekeepers Association. It's great to be able to present to you again at the fall conference. Hopefully, it's nice to present in a virtual format, but hopefully we'll be able to present in person, and I'll be able to talk to everyone again in 2022, we can hope. Well, anyway, I'm going to talk to you today about some research that has been ongoing in the lab here at OSU on soybean and identifying benefits of soybean bloom for bees, and maybe less convincingly, but identifying the benefits of bee pollination for soybean producers through increased yield. Now, this work has been done by a graduate student in the lab, Harper McMinn-Souder, and a research scientist, Chia Lin, as well as a number of other undergraduates and graduate students throughout the years in the lab here at OSU. So just to give you an outline of what I'm going to be talking about over the next few minutes is how I got into being interested in soybeans, some work that was done a number of years ago on urban versus agricultural productivity in honeybees. Then we'll look for soybean honey in Ohio honey samples collected by you OSBA members. Then we'll look at honey flows in agricultural environments, some work done by Harper. We'll look at differences in attractiveness among soybean varieties, work done by Chia. Look at increased soybean yield with bees, which is less convincing than I might hope, but I'll show you what we've got. And then finally, this upcoming work that we're going to try to really get at this yield question, as well as work with farmers to maximize the benefits of soybeans for honeybees in the state and wherever soybeans are grown. So first off, this is some work that was done by Doug Sponsler, who was the first graduate student that I had in the lab. Doug has since graduated and gone on to a postdoc at the University of Würzburg in Germany, where he's continuing to do research in this area of urban beekeeping. So Doug was a brand new graduate student back in 2011, and he was really interested in whether agricultural or urban areas are better places to keep bees. So Doug designed an experiment working with beekeepers across the state. He found 50 beekeepers that were willing to work with him and willing to collect data on their colonies. And you can see they're well represented in the cities, which are in red here, the forested areas, which are in green, and the agricultural areas, which are in brown on this land cover map. Doug did mapping to identify the landscape around each of these apiaries, and you can see that he found a good diversity of beekeeping landscapes, everywhere from highly urban sites over here on the right, which are filled with red, and on the left, these were highly agricultural sites with a lot of yellow. So you had a good gradient to answer this question, whether bees do better in urban or rural environments. And the design of this study was to follow new colonies started by packages in the spring of each of these years, 2012 and 2013. And the beekeepers, these 50 beekeepers participating in this, filled out a survey right after they installed the package, and then later in the season in September, so they could tell us how those packages fared over the foraging season. And the idea here is that a package starts out really as a uniform unit. You know, there's about 10,000 bees and a queen in each package, and the success of that package over the foraging season is going to be largely related to the environment that package is installed in. There's not a lot of beekeeper intervention over the good months of the summer, and so any changes in honey production or colony size should be really related to the landscape those bees are foraging in. And the results that Doug found were that, contrary to his hypothesis, bees actually did better in more agricultural areas here in Ohio and did worse in urban areas. Now, there's a lot of variation because there's a lot of variability between particular sites, but the trend was that honeybee colonies located in urban sites made less honey over the course of that summer than bees located in more agricultural sites. And so this really got us thinking, what is it about these agricultural sites that is superior to urban sites? Well, obviously, it's the agriculture. I mean, the crop fields, which are largely planted in corn and soybeans here in Ohio, really dominate this agricultural landscape. And we began to suspect that it's not the trees or the weeds growing along the road margins. That's a relatively small amount of area in these highly agricultural sites, but it's actually in the fields. It's the crops themselves that are providing a benefit for bees in these agricultural areas. And corn, field corn is not known to be a great source of nectar. Not a lot of honey produced off of field corn. Actually, no honey produced off field corn. So it must be the rotational partner of corn, and that is soybeans, that may be contributing to this increased productivity in cropland. So that got us interested in whether honeybees visit soybean flowers at all, because at the time, not many people were talking about soybean honey, and we had to go into Eva Crane's book, her seminal book, A Comprehensive Survey of Honey, and she does have an entry for soybean in here. She calls it light, rather thin, peculiar, unpleasant flavor, which is not a glowing review of soybean honey. I've since tasted it, and I kind of disagree. I think it's a nice, neutral, sweet honey. But it gave us the evidence that we needed to go forward and say, yes, honeybees can collect honey from soybeans, at least in enough quantity for Eva Crane to do a tasting on it. And this is something we really need to explore further. I think the reason that soybeans are really underappreciated and have been historically is that they are not really showy. It's hard to even see that a soybean field is in bloom when you look across the landscape like this field here, because these flowers are tiny and they're buried underneath the canopy where you can barely even see them. And the bees that are visiting these flowers are largely hidden underneath that canopy as well. Additionally, each flower produces just a tiny amount of nectar. I mean, they're very small flowers to begin with, so they don't produce much nectar, but that nectar actually turns out to be very high in sugar content and could be very attractive to bees if they can find them and can harvest nectar from them. So soybean is really widespread in the U.S., and I think this is a reason that this work is really needed. There are 83.8 million acres of soybeans planted in this country, and it's traditionally been considered low-quality forage for bees in many places. In the South, that may be less so, but the real question was, are bees visiting soybeans here in the North? There's certainly anecdotal reports from beekeepers about honey flows during the soybean bloom, and that was one other thing, is talking with beekeepers at this meeting at the OSBA Fall Conference really got me into working on this soybean question. And since then, there have been some publications indicating that there's really a burst of colony growth when soybeans are in bloom, probably from the nectar and pollen resources that those flowers are providing. So the question is, are Ohio soybeans really beneficial for bees? And how can we make soybeans better for bees? So to start out, we really need to document that bees here in Ohio are visiting soybeans. So I published this short article in the Ohio State Beekeepers newsletter back in 2014. Soybeans, Golden Goose or Tofu Turkey was the title. I'm still very proud of that title. And in this article, we invited beekeepers to bring summer honey samples to the fall conference meeting in November of 2014. And the idea was that we would collect that honey and do pollen analysis at the meeting to identify what quantity of the honey they provided to us was from soybean. Now, this was wildly ambitious, and we had no idea that so many beekeepers would be interested in this question. We were flooded with samples, more than we could possibly analyze at the meeting. So we took those back to the lab, and it took another year and an undergraduate's dedicated labor to get through all of those samples. And it was so successful, we've done it again in 2017, 2018, and 2019 to get over 200 summer honey samples with location information provided by the beekeeper, and we've done pollen analysis on many of these samples to identify what flowers they came from, what flowers the bees were visiting when they made this honey. So the way we identify the source of honey is by extracting out the pollen. And to do that, all honey has a little bit of pollen in it, and that can serve as a fingerprint for the floral source of the nectar that went in to make that honey. So to get the pollen out of this honey, the first thing you have to do is thin it down with 70% ethanol. Then we put it into a centrifuge tube, put it in a centrifuge, and that pollen will get pulled out of this honey and ethanol mixture and will accumulate at the bottom of the centrifuge tube. We can then drain off that liquid and can take out this pollen pellet and put it on a microscope slide stained with basic fuchsia jelly. And then we can put that under a microscope, and we can actually identify the pollen grains using microscopy to determine which flowers contributed to the nectar that went on to make that honey that the beekeeper is providing us. Here's a picture of soybean pollen that we did find in some of the honey samples. And we've done this, we really should put this together into one big data set, but here's the data we have from 2017. This was produced by Luke Heron, a former undergraduate in the lab. And we have the time of honey harvest here on the x-axis, and we have the proportion of soybean honey by mass on the y-axis. And you can see that in the months when soybean is blooming, which is largely July and August, that we can get up to 45% of that mass of honey was actually derived from a soybean plant. So it's a substantial contribution that soybean is making to honey production for beekeepers here in the state of Ohio, particularly if they are situated in an area where soybeans are available. So here, there's soybean bloom. So this led a newer graduate student, Harper McMay-Souder, to ask the question, how does agricultural intensity, how does this intensive corn and soybean landscape impact honeybee foraging and colony weight change? And I'm going to present some of her results here. And she did this by assessing how the colony weight changes over time, through season, and through space, depending on the agricultural intensity of the landscape. And then she also went on to identify the floral resources in the honey by doing this kind of honey analysis with pollen, but she used a different method. She actually used pollen metabarcoding rather than microscopy. So here's some pictures of the Ohio agro-ecosystem again. Here we've got soybean, which we now suspect to be a mass flowering resource when it's at peak bloom. But there's a lot of other things in the agro-ecosystem as well that probably are major contributors as well, despite what we, Doug and I, thought at the beginning. There are a lot of weeds here. There's dandelions and clovers growing along the field edges. And there are supplemental plantings that are gaining in popularity, such as the CP42 and the CRP program plantings that specifically seek to encourage pollinator-friendly plants in this agricultural landscape. So the question is, what soybean? Are they foraging on weeds? Are they foraging on these CRP plantings with pollinator forage in them? And then how does this interact over time? Which ones are consistent and which ones are variable by site? So in 2019, Harper did this study at sites around Columbus, Ohio here. And this included some highly agricultural sites, which are indicated in red out here, west and south of Columbus. Some kind of moderately agriculturally intensive sites in yellow, and then some control sites with low agricultural intensity in Columbus and north of Columbus, which is largely forest or suburbia rather than agricultural land. And we set out apiaries in each of these sites and put pollen traps on these colonies to collect pollen, even though that's not what I'm going to show you here. We also, this is part of a larger study, and hopefully I can share the results of this with you at some other time. But one thing that she put on these colonies were these broodminder hive scales. These are really neat scales that continuously monitor the weight of the colony. You put this underneath the bottom board, between the hive stand and the bottom board, and they record the weight every 5 minutes of that colony. And then you can just take out your phone and download this data through Bluetooth and get a running tally of the colony's weight over the entire foraging season. And it's actually relatively affordable. They're only about $170 each. And they're really user-friendly, much easier than going out and manually weighing the colonies, on a weekly basis. This gives you much better data, and they can really give you a sense of when there's periods of flow and dearth in colonies in these different landscapes. And just here's some of the data that comes off of these broodminders. This is raw data from our apiary at Farm Science Review west of Columbus on I-70. And you can see this is the weight changes over the months, and you can see there's increases over the month of May and June. You can see there's a decrease here probably when some honey was harvested, and then it starts to increase again. So you can kind of get a story for each individual colony just by looking at this weight data. That's really, really fascinating to look at on its own. But the question is, how do we analyze this data in a more quantitative way to really extract the information that we want out of this, which is when are the periods of honey flow and when are the periods of honey dearth, and how do those correspond to the periods of soybean bloom in this landscape? So the way Harper did this, she did this with some statistical software. She took the raw data and smoothed it out, got rid of the obviously interfering events such as honey harvest, and then standardize the data against each other so that we can see when the periods of growth are and the periods of decline, and then can compare those with each other to identify these periods over the foraging season. And then for the 2019 data, this is the results from the period of soybean bloom, which is from early July to, we'll be generous and say the soybeans were blooming up until the 1st of September. And this is organized by agricultural intensity at these different sites, everywhere from a highly agricultural landscape with 90% agriculture in the foraging range. This is at western branch of the OARDC stations. And then here at the Rothenbuehler Bee Lab on Waterman Farm, right in the middle of Columbus, we have essentially 0% agriculture. And you can see this slope going up indicates that there's honey flow during the early part of this period, and then that kind of levels out as soybean bloom presumably trails off once we get into late August. We wanted to know where the honey that was giving the colonies this weight was coming from, so we again did analysis of the residual pollen that's in the honey, and we did this again by extracting the pollen from these nectar samples. This was it's generous to call it honey. This was actually nectar that was scraped off the comb of these hives when Harper was out there visiting them on a monthly basis. And then I'm going to show you the metabarcoding data, but there was also microscopy done on these samples as well. And she did this by bead beating the pollen that we got out of this honey to disrupt that tough pollen coat. And then we used specific PCR primers to amplify a particular piece of the DNA from the plant. And we used PCR to amplify that particular section. And then we submitted this amplified DNA for DNA sequencing here in Worcester. And from this information, after some bioinformatic analysis, we can get some figures showing which plants were contributing to the nectar that was harvested by the bees during these different periods of time. And so here are Harper's results from 2019, and she's got it divided up into periods when there or during apiaries with high agricultural intensity, medium agricultural intensity, and low agricultural intensity. So these results are from the nectar collected in the high agricultural sites, and we see she's got the plant genera on the y-axis here and the date of sampling on the x-axis. These were all from late July in this particular study, and there were really only two different plants that the bees were foraging on in the high agricultural sites during July. One of them was Trifolium, which is clovers. The other one was soybean. So it should come as no surprise to any beekeeper that they were foraging on clovers, but this is really the first evidence we have in high agricultural sites that really a substantial amount of that nectar they're collecting is indeed from soybean, just as we had predicted. If we get into middle density agricultural sites, this is kind of an intermediate between the high and the low agriculture sites, we start to get more different plants showing up in the nectar harvested. But again, it's largely clovers and soybean again. Even though the bees have access to a lot of other things, they're not harvesting nectar from those in any great quantity. And finally, at our low agricultural site, these are the ones in more urban Columbus, you can see that, again, Trifolium up here is a major constituent in honey collected in late July. But even in these highly urban sites, we still see a bit of soybean. So these bees are finding some soybean if it's available and bringing that back to the colony. Also, a little bit of plantago. That's actually this plantain that grows in people's yards. And this shows up a surprising amount in the nectar samples that we've collected. So I guess that plantain in your lawn is probably underappreciated for its contribution to bee productivity as well. So here's just a summary of the entire 2019 season that Harper put together. We've got Trifolium up here, and you can see that bees love clover. It's true. Bees really, really like clover. But down here, we also have soybean. So soybean is easily number 2 here, and there's even some indication that during this period, when soybean is in abundant bloom, that the bees are giving up on their old favorite clover and maybe switching over to take advantage of the soybean that's abundant in the landscape during that period. So Harper followed this up with a new study in 2020 and 2021, where she's really focusing on these agriculturally intensive areas to look at the contribution of soybean and the contribution of these conservation reserve plantings in these areas. And so here are the additional sites up here around Toledo in blue and in yellow, and it's just the ones that are up here that we're going to be focusing on for this next part of the study. Again, she collected nectar from these colonies, and here she is scraping some nectar cells into our collection tube. Again, she used these broodminder hive scales at 3 per apiary. There's all the honey that she collected from August 15th of last year. Interesting to see the variety of colors that are there. And here are the colony weight data results from this period from mid-June through 1st of September. And you can see that, again, at these sites, there's really substantial weight gain that's going on from about the 1st of July through about the 1st of August. That corresponds very nicely with the period when soybean is blooming. And so here are her pollen results from the nectar she collected during this period. Again, we've got abundant trifolium or clover, and we've got more soybean. Again, soybean is probably a strong number 2 in the bees' preference in the month of July at these more northern sites in higher agricultural intensity. So here's just a summary of all the metabarcoding results, not quite as clear as in 2019, but again, we've got trifolium up here, which is a clear favorite of the bees in this year as well. And we've again got soybeans down here, glycine, which are popular throughout the period when the soybeans are blooming. Again, we've got this plantago. This is that plantain that shows up in your yard, and a bit of vitis, which was kind of unexpected. That's grape. I previously did not know that grape was a major contributor, but it appears that in some sites, grape is a good, can contribute to nectar flows if it's available. So some interesting, unexpected results out of this as well. But really, there's no question that clover and soybean are really driving honey production in many areas of Ohio. So the conclusions are that Harper has made is that the colonies are gaining weight in July in these agricultural areas, largely due to soybean and clover. And there's really great potential to improve the landscape during this period to improve it for honey production and for overall bee health. But there are some really deep questions that remain in this relationship between soybeans and honeybees, because it appears to be somewhat inconsistent across sites, and certainly not every soybean field is going to attract bees. It appears that there appear to be other factors affecting soybean attractiveness for bees, and this is something that Dr. Chia Lin has really gotten into over the last several years. We know that there are abiotic factors such as weather or soil conditions. It's generally accepted that you need really hot conditions and you need a more alkaline soil pH in order for these soybeans or legumes in general to really produce a lot of nectar. There's maybe other landscape effects such as competing floral resources. That clover may be drawing bees away from a soybean field, even though Harper suggests that the opposite may actually be true. But what Chia has really started to dig into is this effect of soybean varieties. There are hundreds of different soybean varieties that the breeders have produced and that are available on the commercial market. And they come in, the most obvious difference is the color of the flower. Some of them have these white flowers, others have more of a purple flower. And there's been some publications indicating that bees may prefer purple flowers, but there's probably a lot of other things going on with these soybean varieties related to their attractiveness to bees that really has never been recorded or identified. So Chia set out to examine this question. What varieties do we look at, and how many varieties are actually on the market? So thankfully, there is someone who's an expert in this. Dr. Laura Lindsay is in the Department of Hort and Crop Science here at OSU, and she runs this Ohio soybean performance trial each year where they evaluate different soybean varieties for yield and oil production and a whole bunch of other characteristics. And they've got a field where they have 192 plots of these different soybean varieties. There were 187 varieties planted in 2019 in the data that I'm going to show you, and Chia collected data on 158 of these varieties. Really a fantastic opportunity to give the bees kind of a taste test, a choice of which soybean varieties do they prefer when they're given the choice of all of these, almost 200 different varieties. So what Chia did is she went out to these soybean plots and just started counting honeybees that are in the soybeans, visiting those flowers. And she very quickly learned that it's quite difficult to count bees in soybeans because these flowers are beneath the canopy where you really can't even see the flowers and you can't see the bees either. So she made the observation that it's actually easier to hear the bees than it is to see them. And unfortunately, this audio clip is not going to play for you, but you hear this buzzing when you're close to bees that are visiting the flowers. And this is a much easier way to identify bees in a particular patch just by listening for them rather than trying to observe them visually. This is a really innovative approach that has been taken advantage of by another graduate student in the lab, Hannah McKenzie. And hopefully you'll see her presentation over the lunch hour. She's got a short presentation on using this audio method to identify bee foraging in soybeans using audio recording. So the results of Chia's observations on bee visitation in these different plots, 158 different soybean varieties, she categorized this in the number of minutes that she heard bees in these different plots by the number of varieties exhibiting this. Obviously, varieties with more bees per minute are more attractive to the bees. But she found that there were a lot of varieties with kind of a middling attractiveness, but then there were a handful of varieties that were highly attractive, and this one variety out here really had 9 bees per minute in it, one very highly attractive variety. Some of them were not attractive at all. So she wanted to know, what are the floral characteristics that are driving this bee preference that she's observing by listening to the bees? So she got everyone in the lab out to these soybean field trial for 2 hours of observation of the soybeans themselves on an August day. This is right before we had a lab picnic. Everyone got to go out and check the soybeans before they came to the picnic. And they harvested 12 flowers per plot and put these flowers in centrifuge tubes so that she could measure the characteristics of the flowers as well as the amount of nectar that these flowers were producing. So she measured the color, she measured the nectar volume using a capillary tube, and she measured the sugar concentration. Here's a picture of Chia's daughter, Ellen, using a refractometer to look at the sugar nectar concentration in the nectar that was collected from these different soybean flowers. So she found that of the varieties looked at, 127 were purple, 27 were white, and 4 of them had mixed color. And there was no variability, no significant difference in flower size, nectar production, or bee counts based on color. So color by itself is not a good indicator of bee preference. Nectar production. There was a wide variability in nectar production on this one day of observation in August. Some of them had large volumes of nectar. Some of them had essentially no nectar at all. Or excuse me, this is the number of flowers with nectar present in the flower. And the volume of nectar present, if there was nectar present at all. And again, you can see that most of them had a small amount of nectar, but some of them had very large amounts of nectar that she could retrieve with that capillary tube. And the sugar concentration, there was also variability here as well. Most of them had a relatively lower sugar concentration in the range of 10 to 20%, but some of them had a much higher concentration as well. So there's a lot of variability here for the bees to be choosing upon. And she did some statistical analysis on these, and she found that bees prefer flowers with nectar in them. That should come as no surprise to anybody. Bees don't like dry flowers that give them no nectar. And nectar volume was also more attractive to bees as well. Sugar concentration, plant density, and plant height had no impact on the bees' visitation of these different varieties. So Chia built on this observation by setting up some caged pollination experiments where she planted 4 of these soybean varieties in cages and then put a nucleus colony of bees in here to give the bees more of a restricted choice test to see which flowers the bees were visiting preferentially. So we've got 2 varieties of highly attractive soybean based on her previous work, and 2 varieties of low attractive soybean. And she picked 1 purple variety and 1 white variety, even though there was no significant difference between these varieties or color variety in their attractiveness to bees. And we also are trying to get data out of this on soybean yield, so we included some cages that had no bees augmented in them. So some of these cages had bees added, some of them had no bees added, so we can look at the value of bee pollination. I'm not going to show those results to you today, but hopefully I'll be able to share that with you in the future. What she found is that there were differences in visitation to these different soybean varieties when the bees were confined like this, and that this high nectar producing variety with white flowers was more attractive than the low nectar producing varieties with either white or purple flowers. This high nectar producing variety with purple flowers was kind of intermediate between the two. And she found that there were temporal variations in the nectar production. Over time, things changed actually quite drastically. This is something that really needs to be dug into more thoroughly. You can see that this is the volume of nectar that she was collecting out of these different flowers. And a lot of this was really driven by the fact that the low nectar producing varieties, many of those never really fully opened. And this may be one of the reasons that they're not attractive to bees, is just because they don't really open under some conditions and they never allow the bees the opportunity to collect nectar from them. So the conclusions that Chia made is that there is great variability in varietal differences in attractiveness to soybeans, and this is something that really has been unappreciated so far. And this would be really nice to work with the soybean breeders and the companies to identify particular varieties of soybean that are highly beneficial for bees and other pollinators if they're planted. A lot of this variability is really driven by the nectar production, which bees undoubtedly respond to very strongly. So finally, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the impact of bee pollination on soybean yield. This is really from the grower's perspective, and this is the issue that's going to drive adoption of maybe these varieties of soybeans that are attractive to bees, or possibly reduced use of insecticides during bloom. If we can convince the growers that having those bees in the field actually improves their yield. This is more challenging work because there's already a huge amount of variability in soybean yield based on all sorts of other environmental and soil conditions. But I'm just going to show you an example of the experiment that we did over 2018, 2019, and 2020. And this is where we actually placed nucleus colonies in the middle of soybean fields and then looked at the soybean yield around these colonies related to this increased bee pollination that should be coming from these nucleus colonies placed in the middle of soybean fields. So putting bees in the middle of a soybean field is a challenging thing, and this is the reason we're not doing this experiment anymore. I actually had to modify a backpack in order to haul these nucleus colonies out to the middle of a soybean field. It's actually very difficult work to get them out there, and I don't recommend anyone go put bees in the middle of a soybean field, I guess, unless you have a road that you can drive on to get them out there. So after the soybeans have dried down and just before they're harvested, we hand harvested some of the soybeans. We did 10 plants at each of these blue spots along these 4 transects in the directions away from these bee colonies, right next to the bee colonies, midpoint, and then out along the field edge. And we wanted to see, is there a response? Is there more soybean productivity here near the bee colonies than at the midpoint or the edge? And so Chia measured these soybean plants that we harvested, looked at the number of pods per node, the rate of full pods, the grams of seed material, and the total seed weight per plant. And we found that there actually was a tantalizing difference, that there is a slightly increased seed weight per plant right next to these honeybee colonies. It went down at the midpoint and then generally went up at the edge, which is what we think would be the signature of bee pollination at these sites, is that there was reduced seed weight at the midpoint, furthest from either the edge or the honeybee colonies. But there's a lot of variability between fields, and it's going to take some additional trials to really nail down the benefits of pollination to the soybean grower in a way that will be convincing to them. So we're following up on this project in 2022, and we actually just got a funding from USDA to pursue this project. Chia wants to plant soybean nectar-rich varieties on farms, and she wants to work with soybean growers and beekeepers in order to do this. And additionally, she wants to find growers that are willing to try out this method that has been pioneered at Farm Science Review by Nate Duridas there, where they take the low-producing soybean acres within the field, and with modern yield monitors, they can identify the acres that are actually costing the grower money. And rather than waste money planting soybeans in these low-yielding acres, Nate's idea was to convert these over into pollinator habitat within the field. And this is possible using modern planter technology, which has GPS built into it, and they can actually identify these low-yielding areas and plant them with a clovers or other pollinator-friendly crops or plants. And Chia's idea is to combine this kind of internal pollinator habitat with a nectar-rich soybean variety to see if we can really maximize the benefits of the soybean fields to bees in areas where there's a close relationship with between soybean growers and beekeepers. So if any of you are beekeepers or soybean growers that are interested in this, please reach out to me or Chia. We're interested in talking to you and setting up these experiments in the coming year. And you should check out this YouTube video if you're interested in this. Just search Red Acres Green, and it will produce this 5-minute video that was produced by Farm Science Review on these internal pollinator habitats in the low-yielding acres within a field. And then rather than using hand harvesting, we really would like to start using yield monitors to better quantify the benefits of bee pollination on soybean yield. But again, the challenge has been finding growers that are both willing to work with us on this question and where there are bees available nearby to actually potentially influence the soybean yield. So in summary, it's very clear now that soybean contributes substantially to honey production here in the state of Ohio, and we're really just starting to scratch the surface on identifying which soybean varieties are the good nectar producers and that are maximally supporting that honey production. It appears that soybean growers in the state are likely to maybe get a small yield benefit, but really more work is needed in that area. And I think it's really needed because it's this yield benefit that will convince soybean growers that their benefit from bee pollination outweighs any small benefit they might get from insecticide application during soybean bloom, and that insecticide application during that period really is a bad idea, not just for the bees, but for their bottom line as well. And really our long-term goal here is to improve the economic efficiency of soybean farming with more bee-friendly management practices. That's the goal going forward. So really, everyone in the lab contributed to this. Here's a picture of the lab that I took a few years ago, so I want to thank everyone. And I also want to thank the Ohio State Beekeepers Association for funding some of this work. They bought those brood minders that Harper has been using, the North Central Soybean Research Program, and USDA NIFA for funding much of the research shown here. If you have questions, please submit them by email, or I'll be on and I'm happy to answer questions as you put them in. Thanks.